I love the lab school. It saves kids. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my clients it saved. Kids who hated themselves and hated school and thought they were stupid and came here, and it was life transforming. And Catherine, I just can't thank you folks enough for what you do. And it's just an honor to be here. And I gave my first lecture in this lecture series 32 years ago. And I've tested kids for probably 34 years, and they always say these interesting things and fun things, and arguably the best thing a kid ever said to me, testing. Can you hear me in the back okay? This is in the first couple of years of my career, I was testing a 5-year-old, and a vocabulary test. I said, "What's a cow?" And he said, "I can't believe you don't know that." So I want to tell you just a little bit. I wrote this book with my dear friend Ned Johnson, and Ned is the premier test prep guy, ACT, SAT kind of prep. It has a big 3 offices in the DC, Northern Virginia area, and is a brilliant guy. And he spent more time with 16 and 17-year-olds, the most stressful period of their life, probably, their adolescence at least, than anybody in the country. And I love the fact that, you know, he sees these incredibly high-powered, kind of peel them off the wall kind of kids, a lot of very intense families, and that he and I recommend the same thing. And I see kids who are struggling in school, and that we think a lot alike, and the same things work for kids if they're poor or rich, if they're good students or not. And so we started lecturing together probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and we lectured a lot about how kids become self-motivated. And we lectured a lot about the effects of stress on the brain and what chronically stress does to a kid's development. We lectured a lot about sleep. We lectured a lot about kids' ability to make decisions for themselves. And a couple of years ago, we were talking about, we said, let's write something up. And we were talking about what's kind of the organizing theme for what we talk about. And Ned said, everything really, it falls together under the heading of a sense of control. And I had known for 10 years, there's a gal in Montreal by the name of Sonia Lupien who said that the things that make life stressful can be summarized with the acronym NUTS: novelty, unpredictability, threat, and a low sense of control. And the idea is that stress makes you nuts. And it's a really nice, it's a useful acronym. And many scientists think that it's that low sense of control that's the most stressful thing in the universe. And I mean, think about it. You got a sick kid, and there's nothing, your kid's struggling, and you've tried everything. You feel like you've tried everything. There's nothing more stressful. That feeling that I can't do anything about this. Or if you feel helpless, you feel hopeless or overwhelmed, there's nothing more stressful. So we knew that a sense of control was really huge in terms of, if we didn't want kids to be stressed all the time, and didn't have all the negative effects of being stressed from a learning point of view, from a mental health point of view, this is a big deal. And we also knew that every angle on developing motivation in kids that we knew about, it all focused on autonomy, on a sense of autonomy or a sense of control. And we thought it's so much of what we do, what Ned tries to do is to help a lot of overly intense clients develop a healthier motivational pattern that's not so rooted in fear that they aren't going to achieve. And a lot of kids I see worried that they aren't doing well in school, they've already screwed up their whole life, why bother? And so we thought that if autonomy is crucial for the development of motivation, and it's really a big deal in terms of stress tolerance and resistance to chronic stress, I said it must be a big deal. So I started studying just the sense of control itself. And some of you know the construct of internal versus external locus of control. You heard of this, people started studying it in the 60s. And the idea, if you have an internal locus of control, that you have a sense, it doesn't mean you're controlling, it just means you have a sense that I can handle this, you know, that my decisions make a difference and I can direct my life, and I'm not just completely the mercy of the gods or external forces, that it's good for everything. It's good for health, it's good for longevity. People in nursing homes, if you just give them a choice about, do you want to have visitors at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, stuff like that, they live longer. And it's not control itself. It's a sense of control. So you can be sitting in a hotel room, and there's an obnoxious buzzing coming from the room next door. And somebody from the hotel comes and says, here's a little button. If you press the button, it'll make that buzzing quieter. And you press that button, and your stress levels go down, even the button has nothing to do with the buzzer. That it's that sense of control that's really an extremely useful thing. And so we basically, and I'll say that the antonyms to a sense of control, a healthy sense of control, are hopeless, helpless, resigned, and overwhelmed. And stuff it doesn't reflect a very healthy brain state. So we basically wrote this how-to manual for parents and educators as well, but primarily for parents, about how do we help kids develop a healthy sense of control or autonomy. And this is the first time that I've ever lectured in 32 years since I've been here, started here, without a handout. And it's because everything I'm talking about is in a book, and I want you to buy it. And I said, we got a pretty nice advance, and I've already got almost all the money I'm going to get for the book. I've already got it. So it's not going to make a ton of money off the books. But the reason I wanted to do a book was because a lot of the stuff that we recommend, it's really useful, it's powerful, but it's hard. It's hard because we have so many ideas about what kids, in this, at least in this area, the pressures that we experience and the fear we have about our kids, and going against that is hard. And I wanted to have the rationale for focusing on this sense of autonomy and trusting kids in one place where you can reread it. So I was at a book signing, actually I was at Politics and Prose for a friend of mine's book a couple weeks ago, and he said buy a copy for your family and your friends. And I said, well, why not your known enemies? I mean, it'll probably improve things in relationship with your enemies as well. So I watch it, so that's why. And also, this is the first time in a long time I haven't used any kind of PowerPoint. And I thought, you know what? I just want to tell you the story about what this book's about. And it's also true that PowerPoint isn't a very good teaching tool. You actually learn more if you just listen to what somebody says. So in any case, Ned and I are very different backgrounds, very, very different training. He's a generation younger than I am. He's like 47, and I'm over 20 years older. And I'm a generation where, like a friend of mine who's my age, a few years ago, her granddaughter, 5-year-old granddaughter says, Grandma, how old are you? And she says, 65. And the kid says, starting from 1? So yeah, I get that kind of thing, you know. So basically, what we're addressing is what Ned and I call the twin scourges of stress-related mental health problems and these kind of extremes, motivational extremes, you know, and from a mental health point of view, I mean, most of you know, I mean, that we're really experiencing this kind of epidemic of stress-related mental health problems in children. And there's a woman at San Diego State by the name of Jean Twenge who studies generational differences, and she brilliantly used this test, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, that was developed in the 30s. And in the early 2000s, she compared the responses to this MMPI of adolescents and young adults, like in 2002 or 2004, to the responses of people at the height of the Great Depression, during World War II, during the Vietnam War. What she found was that the young people in the early 2000s were 5 to 8 times more likely to report symptoms of anxiety disorder or depression than people had generations ago. And the same person, Jean Twenge, wrote an article in The Atlantic last year saying that what she discovered in the last 7 years is an unprecedented spike in anxiety and depression in young people, which she thinks is related in significant part to the smartphone, and particularly to social media. Because it's all these mental health problems, or most of them, anxiety and depression, you see it more in girls than in boys, and the social media is much more of an issue for girls than for boys. So there's a lot of it, and it's related. These are stress-related disorders in the sense that if you have an anxiety disorder, or you have depression, and you look at an MRI scan of your brain, a functional MRI, what you see is a hyperactive amygdala. That's the one thing that shows up virtually invariably, is an overreactive, overly sensitive threat detector. The amygdala is a part of the brain that senses and reacts to threat, and that's what shows up. I mean, anxiety is an overactive stress response, and depression is really kind of a worn-out stress response. And so we know that being chronically stressed just isn't good. I mean, we don't want to protect kids from stress because it's dealing with stressful situations and then recovering, through which you develop resilience. That's how you develop really high stress tolerance, is you deal with a stressful situation and then you recover. What we don't want is for kids to be chronically stressed, where they don't have time to recover, because that changes the brain in ways that make kids more likely just to have ongoing depression and vulnerability, or ongoing anxiety and vulnerability to depression. So this mental health problem is a big issue. And Ned and I think that, I mean, I started to think 20 years ago when I started to study the effects of stress in the brain, that if we really took this seriously, that we'd be thinking about it the way we do climate change, or the way we're starting to think now about repeated blows to the head, these concussions, where we don't blow them off anymore. We think that it has a pretty profound effect. And in terms of the motivational, I want to say one other thing. One line of research that Ned and I really looked at a lot was this guy named Steve Meyer, he's one of the world's best psychologists, and he's in Colorado. And what he did was he shocked mice. He put mice in a little cage, and he'd shock them. And then obviously extremely stressful. Their stress hormones would go off the charts. And they'd give them a little wheel, and the mice could turn. If the mice turned the wheel, the shocking would stop. And what Meyer demonstrated time and time again was that experience of being able to control a stressful situation basically changed the mice's brain, in the sense that as soon as they started to get stressed, as soon as they got a tiny bit of shock, they'd go into coping mode. Their prefrontal cortex would activate, they go into coping mode. And what he said, that over time, these rats became very hard to stress because they had that experience of being able to control it. He said that controllable stressing, being able to control a stressful situation, basically it inoculates you to stress. So we're thinking that this is a big deal. Now, from a motivational perspective, how many of you know the growth mindset, Carol Dweck? It's a lot of you. And so what it is, Carol Dweck, this is such an interesting thing. Carol Dweck was fascinated by kids who, if you gave them the choice between doing something easy or hard, wanted to do something hard, and as it got harder, they worked harder because they just loved the challenge. They loved the challenge of mastering something or figuring something out. And then over last 20 years, she studied, what do these kids think? You know, what are these kids who like that? What do they think? How do they think? They have she concluded, they have a growth mindset. That they see that my ability is as a result, in large part, of my own effort. And that I can develop my talent. I'm not just born with and the kids with a fixed mindset have the idea that I'm born with a certain amount of ability. Everything's a test of how smart I am, how competent I am. So give me something easy so I don't look stupid. And if it gets hard, I'm going to quit because I don't want to fail at something that I actually tried on. And so this growth mindset, basically, it's a sense of control that I can develop my abilities through my own efforts. I can control my fate through my own efforts. Now, how many of you know self-determination theory? Anybody heard of this? These two guys in New York developed one of the best supported theories in psychology. It's called self-determination theory. And it holds that as human beings, we have three basic needs: for a sense of relatedness or connectedness to people, for a sense of competence, and for a sense of autonomy. And what it holds is that for motivation, autonomy is the most important thing. And as Ned and I were researching this, we said, let's make sure we're right. And we called Edward Deci, one of the guys who developed self-determination theory. We said, are we right that autonomy is really the key for developing self-motivation? And he said, it's absolutely the key, because you can't develop it without it. You have to have a sense of this is my life, and I get to run it and learn from your own mistakes to really develop true self-motivation. So we saw it there, and we saw it also in flow theory. Some of you know this term flow in psychology. Flow refers to when you're really engaged in something that requires your full attention and full effort, and it's not highly stressful. So if you're a tennis player, it's boring to play with somebody who's not very good. And it's extremely stressful and humiliating if you play with somebody who's much better than you are. But if you find somebody who's at your level, where you have to give it your full effort, your full concentration, that you'll have that experience where you'll be playing for an hour and it seems like 20 minutes have gone by. And that's that flow experience. And it turns out that the brain state, when you're in that kind of flow experience, or that complete absorption, is really good. It's a really positive state. And there's a guy named Reed Larson who studied flow theory and has studied adolescent development for the last 30 years. And about 15 years ago, I learned that he had said that what produces self-motivated adolescents and adults, it's not dutifully doing your homework. It's not dutifully doing what other people expect of you. It's that passionate engagement of stuff that you care about or that you love to do. And he said, think about it, because what it does, if you're really into art or music or dance or something, and you're really engaged, and you have experience where you're completely absorbed in something. And I'll just say parenthetically, I'll be happy to talk later about, I think that video games are not entirely in the same category, but what you're experiencing is you're culturing a brain state that's used to high effort, high focus, high attention, high determination, but low stress. And as an adult, I mean, especially in your work life, that's where you want to be. You want to be challenged, you want to be involved, you don't want to be bored, you don't want to be overwhelmed, and you want to be, and this, when I learned this, it made intuitive sense to me, in part because I graduated from high school with a 2.8 grade point average. And I knew I only needed a 2.5 to get into the University of Washington. I still kind of kick myself for working so hard to get a 2.8, but wasting my energy. But I was in a rock and roll band, which is really the most important thing in my life, and I'd spent hours, almost every night, thinking, well, I'll play music, or I'll teach myself a new song, or I'll practice my instrument, or I'll learn something about chord structure or something. And I think I'll do it for half an hour and then do some homework. And I'd come out of my music room 2.5 hours later, and I don't know where I was completely absorbed. I really feel that doing that I developed a brain that when I found something I wanted to study, when something career-wise that made sense to me, I could go pedal to the metal. And so this is kind of why we wrote the book. It's about the mental health part. It's about the motivational part. And now I want to just tell you some of the stuff that we recommend to parents. Well, first I'll say this. There's a chapter in the book. It's about kids who have learning disabilities or ADHD and or autism. And part of it is why the special challenges that kids who have LD or ADHD or autism experience in developing a sense of control. And I mean, with learning disabilities, you think that many kids, I think that many kids, and this is why I love this school so much, many kids develop what I think is pretty close to a PTSD kind of response to doing academic stuff that's hard. They feel stupid, that they tend to avoid it, they go to a very high stress. Just if your reading's really hard and it's embarrassing, just looking at print, your stress hormones jack up big time. And so you have the feeling of being overwhelmed a lot, which is the opposite of a sense of control. If you have if you have learning disabilities, you need a lot of help, and a lot of kids perceive that the help is forced on them, and they resent it. And I think that part of the challenge of developing sense of control is that if you use your energy resisting other people's attempts to help you, it doesn't develop a sense of control. With ADHD, if you have trouble managing your attention, and you have trouble regulating your impulses, or it's hard for you to carry out your goals, you don't develop as easily that healthy sense of autonomy or control. Does it make sense to you? And so like that, and certainly there's special challenges, and I will tell you that I have two kids, and I really think it has nothing to do with me, but they both have PhDs, and one probably could have educated herself. One had learning disabilities and ADHD, and could have easily been here. And by the time he was 22 or 23, people my age hired him because they just wanted him around because he just had really good judgment, and he didn't panic about stuff. And he was a late bloomer, but got a PhD a couple years ago, and is a consultant. And I'm telling you this because what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk, I think it applies to kids where they have learning disabilities. There's more challenges with LD and ADHD, and with autism certainly. But the same stuff works if we do it, if it works. So the first thing I want to tell you is this. The second chapter in our book, first I'll tell you this. For the first half of my career, I did a lot of psychotherapy as well as neuropsychological testing. And I had experiences like this. I'd be talking to a 40-year-old will come in for therapy. So I'd say, so how can I help you? They say, well, I feel like I've spent the first 40 years of my life trying to live up to other people's expectations. I'm trying to figure out what's important to me. Or, I mean, what happened almost every week was I meet somebody who said, I dread dinner time. Because after dinner, it's like World War III trying to get him to do his homework. And I learned in 1986. I actually wrote a couple of papers about homework in 1986. One was an article in McCall's magazine, of all places, about not fighting with homework. But when I learned for the first time that homework doesn't contribute to learning in elementary school, I thought, what is all this fussing and fighting about? One of my colleagues, very early on in my career, went to a seminar on psychotherapy and came back and said, I learned something really useful. They say, don't work harder to help your clients help themselves. Don't work harder to help your clients solve their problems than they work to solve them, because you're going to weaken them, because they're going to become dependent on you. And over the years, I've trained hundreds of tutors. And one of the things I teach is this idea, don't work harder to help a kid help himself than he works. So if you're tutoring somebody and it feels like you're putting all the energy into it, you're kind of fighting him to bring him back, or it feels like he's resentful about being there, you say, something's wrong with this picture. Because I feel like I'm working harder at this than you are. And if I do that, I'm going to weaken you. Because I'm going to give you the idea somehow that I'm responsible for you to get better, and not you. And it's a very powerful thing. And so what happened with me was especially all this homework related to suffering. I wrote in this article in McCall's, I said, if you're fighting with your kid about homework, say, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. I love you too much to fight. That's the title of the second chapter in the book. And so if you stop fighting, what do you do instead? And so what I said in this article was that think about yourself as a consultant to your kid, as opposed to that. I mean, it couldn't theoretically be a parent's responsibility to make their kid do their homework, in part because you can't make a kid do anything against their will. And so if you have the idea, I'm supposed to make my kid do his homework, and your kid slumps to the ground every night and closes his eyes, what are you going to do, prop him up and try to open his eyes? I mean, clearly, you can't make a kid do it. And if you can't make a kid do it, theoretically, it couldn't be a parent's responsibility. Does that make sense? So but part of what the book's about, it's about aligning our thinking with reality. Because oftentimes the parents, we have these ideas of what we're supposed to do that just, there's no reality to them. And the reality is that if you change the energy, with the homework is a good example, you change the energy from somehow my job is supposed to make sure that my kid does it, and does it to a certain level of standard, change it to just remember, this is his life. I can't make him do it. I'm not responsible for it. But so what you say is just say, I love you too much to fight with you about it. But I'm willing to do anything I can to help you. I'm willing to be available from 6:30 to 7:30 every night. I'm willing to get a tutor if necessary, but I'm not willing to fight with you every night and have all this stress. You're the most precious thing in the universe to me, and I just don't want that in our relationship. And also, I don't want to reinforce the idea that somehow somebody other than you is responsible for your own education. And over the years, when people have done this, it's a really powerful thing. I got an email from one of my clients who was reading the book a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I told my son, my 8th grade son, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. And he said, first he smiled at her, then he hugged her, and he said, is there something wrong with you, Mom? So this part of this idea about is that this think about the parent as a consultant. And so the idea is that what we recommend is that we offer help and not try to force it. We offer advice, but not try to, what I do all the time in my work is when I'm talking with kids about their problems, is I say, is this something you want help with? And I'm looking for buy-in. That I see a lot of kids who think they're stupid, and I say, I'm not going to try to talk you out of that. I'm not going to try to take that away, because I really couldn't. But I see it differently, and if you're interested, I'll be happy to give you my take on it. And I think that if so many parents have to say things like, "I've told them a million times," and well, after the first or second time, we want to stop telling them, and we want to do something different. And so what I'm suggesting, what part of this parent as consultant is you ask, do you want to hear my opinion about that? And it really works. Ned has this cartoon. This guy's talking to his two boys. He says, "Boys, listen up, because I'm only going to tell you this a million times." and so part of it is part of this consultant idea is that we offer help and not try to force it. And we offer advice and not try to force it. And we think about ourselves as a consultant. And we change the energy in a relationship. And kids become much more responsible, but much more honest about themselves. The second component, and this is the third chapter in the book, and I promise I'm not going to go through all 14 chapters, but the third chapter, it's called It's Your Call, and it's about kids as decision makers. And I've felt my whole career that the best thing you can say, the best message you can give an adolescent, besides "I'm crazy about you," is I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and learn from your mistakes. And I want you to have tons of practice making important decisions about your life before I send you off to college. And it turns out, and the reason I got into this, in part because when I started neuropsychological testing in 1984, it was much more common for kids to repeat a grade in public school than it is now. And very frequently, the kid just needs the gift of time, or kids who have learning problems would just repeat them. And what I'd see is I saw a lot of 20-year-olds. And I'd say, "So where are you in school?" And they'd say, well, I'm a freshman in college. I should be a sophomore, but my parents made me repeat the first grade. They're still pissed about it all these years later, And so what I started to do, and maybe this sounds crazy maybe, what I started to do is say, let's tell your first grader that the school's recommending they repeat a grade. Let's tell him nobody's going to make him repeat a grade. But let's say, it's going to be your call, but let's think through the pros and cons. And I'd see a 7-year-olds who you'd write it down. The advantages of repeating are that it'll be easier when you actually have to learn to read. It'll be easier to do it. And also, you're friends with some of the kids in kindergarten, and they'll be friends with those kids. They'll be in your grade, and you know this other kid. And you think through all the pros. And the negative part is that you'll graduate a year later, and there may be kids next year who'll say, "Oh, you're stupid," or "You flunked," and you're going to have to deal with that. And I'd see these 7 or 8-year-olds who at the end, they'd think about it all summer. And then they'd say, "Mom, I think I'm ready. I think I can do it." And if they tease me, I don't care. I'll just walk away. Or kids say, I know I need to stay back. I know I'm not ready. So in any case, I was just kind of experimenting. But what I saw was that even young kids, if we inform them, we help them make informed decisions, can make good decisions for themselves. And the really interesting thing is that there's a whole science of decision making, and what Antonio Damasio taught us many years ago was the best decisions aren't purely logical. If the emotional centers in your brain are injured, you can't decide where to go to dinner or what to have for breakfast, because decision making requires emotion. It requires a sense of what do I want. It requires empathy. It requires feeling how this affects somebody else. And so we want kids tuning in to their own feelings. And what I find is I see all these. So this comes up a lot with me because so many people ask me, where should my kid go to school? And generally, if the kids are certainly if they're 10 or more, I say I think the best question, the best question is, what's the best way to help your kid figure out where to go to school? And so I saw a kid from the lab, the kid who'd been in the lab school, I think from first grade through eighth grade. And she told her mother that she wanted to go to, I think she didn't want to need the lab school anymore was what it was, but she told her mother that she wanted a bigger social pool, she wanted to go to a different school. And so the mother called me and said, I want you to meet with her, and I tested the kid a couple times, and I want you to meet with her and talk her into staying at the lab school. And I said, I don't believe in doing that. And I said, I would be willing to talk with her and help inform her so that she can make a good decision. And so I met with the girl, and we kind of mapped out the pros and cons of staying at the lab or going to public school or going to another private school. And she talked to people at McLean and someplace else. And we talked to people in the public school about what they'd offer her. And she ultimately concluded that she needed a lab school. And she had a fabulous high school experience here. She just finished college and she got accepted to graduate school in London for next year. And the mom said that expressing confidence that she could figure this out, that this is her life. And we know, kids have a brain in their head and they want their lives to work. And that's my motto, And I think that we want kids to make an informed decision. And that there are some kids who, they're so depressed they can't think straight. Kids who are drug involved and really can't think straight. There's some kids who are rigid and they won't help you let them make an informed decision. Then I think we kind of we do a power play. But short of that, my motto is, where we can, say, unless it's crazy, let's go with the kids' decision making, because we want kids to have confidence in their own ability to make decisions. We want kids to trust themselves. And so, and oftentimes with older kids, with adolescents, and what Ned gets a lot is parents saying, particularly in 11th grade, well, this is 11th grade, the decisions are too important. And what Ned says is, what are decisions in life going to be less important than this? And I think it's a great point. And I can't think of a time where I've encouraged kids to make decisions about themselves, that they haven't been very honest with themselves about what they needed and who they are, and made good decisions. And the third part of this parent as consultant is basically, we want kids as much as possible to manage their own stresses, because of this idea that you become resilient by handling things and recovering from them. And I did this exercise years ago with somebody from PEP, the Parent Encouragement Program, great program. And we made up these scenarios of your kid, your third grade girl comes home and says, everybody else got invited to this birthday party and I didn't. And she's really upset. And the first question we'd ask, this or some other kind of problem, was, whose problem is it? Because it's hard to remember. Because if our kid's unhappy, we get stressed ourselves. And what we want to do is we want to go and solve the problem for them. And I think that there's all kinds of evidence that we want kids to face their fears. We want kids to deal with their own stresses with our support. And Ned and I make a lot out of this. And I'm including things that are really very upsetting. Like one of my tutors years ago told me about this girl, his tutee, in second grade, and the teacher said, "What's the biggest number in the world?" And this little girl tentatively raised her hand and said, 23,000. And the teacher said, "What about 20,001?" And the kid said, "I was so close." So now, the next thing is, there's a chapter in our book called A Non-Anxious Presence. And it's about the idea that it occurred to me some years ago that, you had to be a genius to figure this out. It's easier to soothe an infant if you're calm, right? It makes sense? And if you got a 3-year-old who's having a tantrum, it's easier to deal with it if you don't freak out yourself. And I've been reading about infants who basically come out of the womb very, very highly stressed, very sensitive stress response, and very, very anxious as infants. And what they need from adults, it's not discipline. What they need is warmth and responsiveness. And Ned and I were looking at the work of this guy named Edwin Friedman, who is a rabbi and a business, was a systems consultant, worked with corporations, with churches, synagogues, schools, families. And what he concluded was that we live in a chronically anxious and reactive society in which there are too few people in leadership positions who can serve as a non-anxious presence. Meaning, including families, schools, churches, who aren't anxious, who aren't fearful, who aren't emotionally reactive. And just said that systems work better when that's the case. And we know that there's a whole science of what's called stress contagion. So that they'll measure cortisol levels of kids in school. They got like a student teacher who's really anxious, and the kids' cortisol levels go up. I mean, the teacher's anxiety affects the kids. And there's a lot of evidence of this idea of stress contagion. If a parent is phobic with math, it raises the kid's anxiety level, but only if you try to help them with math. so if you're anxious about math, stay away from your kid. But so the stress is contagious, and so we love the research of this scientist by the name of Michael Meany, who's also one of the top scientists in psychology. And one of the things that Meany did was he took rat pups, and he separated them from their mother for 30 minutes a day for the first couple weeks of their life. And being separated, and they were handled by graduate students. And being handled was extremely stressful for these rats. But then they returned to the mothers, and the rat mothers licked and groomed these baby rats for a long time, which is the kind of equivalent of hugs and kisses and reassurance. And this process of being stressed, coming back, and recovering, and being reassured that you're safe here, that the world is safe. These rats as adults, became almost impossible to stress. The fact that the scientists refer to them as California laid-back rats. And so the idea is we want home to be a safe base. Life is stressful enough for all of us. So that ideally, that we don't have kids don't come home and we don't come home and fight constantly about schoolwork or other things. So this idea, it's just, when we use the phrase a non-anxious presence, we obviously set the bar very high, and luckily kids don't need perfect parents, and luckily parenting is hard. 30 years ago, I tested the kid of a humorist who said, Bill, he said, we really shouldn't call it raising children. We should call it lowering parents. I mean, it's just, it's humbling, but it certainly, it works best. We can be more effective as parents if we are relatively non-anxious and non-reactive. So if our kid comes home with something upsetting, if we don't get more anxious than they do, that's a good thing. What Ned gets all the time is kids coming in and not doing well on a test or not doing well on their practice SAT or something. They say, my mom's going to kill me, or my dad's going to disown me. And the idea, and Ned's point is that we want kids to come to us. If they got something to bother, and if we overreact, we're highly anxious ourselves, and we react more than they do, they're going to avoid us. So this non-anxious presence, and some of the stuff that we recommend, certainly both Ned and I are big fans of Transcendental Meditation. We're big meditation people, and I think that really helps in terms of being a non-anxious presence. We have quite a long section in the book on the idea of taking a long view. And what I mean by that is that all of our fear for our kids, it's about the future. Because if I had a crystal ball and I could reassure you that your kid by the time he's 25 or 20 or 30 is going to be fine, it wouldn't work. All of our fear, it's about that our kids are going to get stuck in some negative place and not get better. And my experience in the last 30-some years is that it doesn't usually happen. Is that kids go through stuff and to get out of it. And that, particularly with kids with learning disabilities or ADHD, where we know that the likelihood is going to be late bloomers, that the prefrontal cortex is going to come online later, that taking this long view is really helpful. And realizing that all of our fear, it's not about now, it's about the future. And we also place a big emphasis on this idea that when I used to do therapy, and I'd work with families that are struggling, I'd say, let's set the highest goal as parents, being just to enjoy your kid, just to enjoy being with them. And we'll kind of work backwards to peel away what's keeping you from enjoying your kid. And my own sense is that, when you just enjoy being with them, kids experience themselves as joy-producing organisms, as opposed to frustration or annoyance-producing organisms. And when we aren't anxious, and we aren't emotionally reactive, we can just simply we can enjoy them. We can lick and groom them more, which is a good thing. Let me just see if there's anything I wanted to tell you more about this idea of a non-anxious presence. Just in terms of this fear of getting stuck, that there's a kid who, he's actually in the last chapter in the book, but I tested him, and then I did some therapy with him and his family when he was a teenager. And he's one of the kids, and there's been a handful of kids over the years that I begged to drop out of high school. This kid was just completely wasting his time and driving his teachers crazy, just tormenting his parents, tormenting his sister. And I said, God, just let him drop out of school. And the parents couldn't go that far, but they sent him to a boarding school, and he ran away. so essentially, and then when he ran away, he was 17, he didn't legally have to be in school, and so he went down to Florida and got a girlfriend there. He's working fast food, and after about 6 months, he called his parents and said, would you pay for me to go to community college here? So he started going to community college, and then after a year or so, he called and said, would you pay if I went to Evergreen College in Olympia, Washington? They got a really good program there. And so and they said, yeah, we would. So he goes out to Olympia, Washington, and he's a master educator in DC public schools now. And I have hundreds of stories. There's a bunch in the last chapter of the book. There's a lot to talk about in a couple of minutes. There's a lot of stories like this. And I just have hundreds. And because I talk about it so much, somebody's always coming up to me and telling me about somebody who's this incredibly late bloomer. I gave a lecture last week, and there's a mother there whose kid I tested many years ago, and he was the most learning disabled kid in the 6th grade here at the lab school. The teacher said he's the most LD kid in his grade here. And he's at a very, one of the best public universities in the country now. And when she told me, my first response was, God, I can't believe it. But I've just done this so long. Okay. He's a little bit extreme. But I've just seen hundreds and hundreds of kids who it's hard to believe getting from here to there. So this not getting stuck is a big deal. So the next thing I want to tell you is that last night I gave a lecture, and I saw this tutor who used to tutor this girl who has autism. And I saw her when she was 5. I didn't see her again until she was 16 and a half. And when she was 16 and a half, I went out to get her in the waiting room, and she came up, she shook my hand, she said, I bet you can tell I've really been working on making eye contact. Well, yeah, okay, I see that, yeah. So the next thing I want to tell you about is that, there's a chapter in the book called Radical Downtime. And I got this idea of radical downtime because some people say, well, my downtime is playing video games or is listening to music at warp speed and it just seems to me that life is so fast-paced, and technology has always made life go faster and made it more stressful. I read a book. You won't believe this. Unless you read the book, it's in the book. But when I was in graduate school, the first time, I flunked out of graduate school the first time, but when I was in it, I read this book. It was on the increased causes of nervousness in America. And it was written in 1881. And the proposed causes were Western Union and the railway, which made life go faster. The pocket watch, which made us more attention to be more anxious about being late, more precise in our time. And I went to the Farmers Museum. Somebody I was talking to today, they're taking their kids to Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame. And I did that a couple times. And if you go to Cooperstown on one day, what do you do the next day? What do you do on Sunday? And there's a Farmers Museum in upstate New York. And I went to the Farmers Museum, and every exhibit this stuff is invented on farms. Every exhibit it said that it was widely anticipated that this new invention would save work, but it actually created more work because it made it easier. Like the steam iron. Before the steam iron, people ironed once a month because it was so hard. They made it easier once a month. They did it once a week. And so the point is simply that because we have such fast-paced life, and kids want to be connected 24/7, we need a lot of radical downtime. Radical downtime meaning when you're ostensibly not doing anything. And the stuff we include in radical downtime are daydreaming, meditating, and sleeping, when you're apparently doing nothing, and yet you're doing things that are profoundly important for your brain and your body. Now, the daydreaming part is, there's all kinds of literature on just having time to kind of self-reflect, being useful for creativity and problem solving. And there's a lot of concern that how many of you know about the brain's default mode network? Anybody hear of this? So about 2000, this guy figured out, functional MRI looks at, if you're counting backwards by 9, how does the brain activation when you're doing that compare to when you're just sitting in the scanner doing nothing, where you're just thinking? But until 2000, nobody studied what does the brain look like when you're just resting. And what they found was there's this dedicated brain network they call the default mode network that only activates when you aren't focused on a task. And if you think about it, if you got here early and just sitting and you didn't open your phone, you sit and you think about your life. You think about yourself and your relationship, and you think about your past and your future. You maybe think about planning your future. And it turns out that the default mode network uses 60 to 80% of the brain's energy. So it's a big deal. And what people are concerned about is kids have so little time just to be with their own thoughts, that this default mode network is not getting wired in a way that it can turn on and turn off really easily, because that being able to turn it on, be able to focus on something and then reflect and build in some downtime, really important for mental health, important for the development of a coherent sense of identity, important for the development of empathy. Because you don't develop an empathy unless you think about, how did that go? I got in a fight with that kid. How did that go? You think about other people. So kids need time, unplugged time, when they think about themselves, think about others, plan alternative futures. The meditation piece is just that, I don't think I've ever had a kid who said, could you find me a meditation teacher? That most kids, frankly, they don't want to meditate. But if their parents do it, if they're in pain, they'll do it. And if other kids are doing it, they'll do it. And I've been involved in helping get meditation into school programs. And a few years ago, I did a couple studies on the use of Transcendental Meditation, which I practiced for 44 years, on middle school kids with ADHD. And the first study we did with that, we got really good results. And we interviewed the kids at the end of 3 months of meditating in school twice a day for 15 minutes. And we asked the kids, what did you notice? And they all said, I'm much less stressed and anxious. Every single kid. And most of them said stuff like, I'm better organized, I can do my homework independently better. And this one kid who was wildly impulsive said that before I started meditating, if I was walking in the hall and somebody bumped me, I'd just turn around and hit him. But now that I've been meditating, if somebody bumps me in the hall, I stop and think, should I hit him or not? And if you know ADHD, this is real improvement, right? The curbing impulsivity. And this teenager with autism who learned TM, somebody's asking him about it, and he apparently said, TM calms the mind and it calms the mom. This is not an anxious presence kind of idea. So I think that because kids need a more radical kind of downtime. I think having time with the eyes closed, that restoring and refreshing the brain is hugely important. And the sleep part is it's just a no-brainer. Many people think that sleep is the most important thing for a developing brain. And I'm testing 5-year-olds who are just yawning all morning now. And I think as a culture, if we don't figure this out, if I was a teacher, I'd much rather teach a kid for 4 hours who slept for 8 hours than teach a kid for 8 hours who slept for 4. I mean, and I think that we got to figure this out, because in addition to all the things all the ways that sleep is so important for learning, what we focus on in the sleep chapter in our book is the importance of sleep for a sense of control. And when you're in your right mind, meaning that you're positive, you aren't overly stressed or anxious, what's happening is your prefrontal cortex, which can think logically but things in perspectively, is regulating the rest of the brain, including the amygdala, that primitive part of the brain that senses and reacts to threat. Once you start to get stressed, your amygdala basically runs the rest of your brain and floods your prefrontal cortex. It's flooded with dopamine and norepinephrine, and it can't function. And so you experience a very low sense of control. And what happens when you get enough sleep is the amygdala becomes 60% more reactive, and the ability of the prefrontal cortex to regulate it becomes much diminished. And there's also the top sleep researcher in the world now, Robert Stixrud at Harvard, says that he thinks that sleep deprivation is a negativity bomb, in the sense that when he's done studies, like you'll learn a list of words. And some of the words are positive, like flower or happiness, and some are neutral words, like table or chair or something, and some are negative words, like death or like this and that. And if you don't get enough sleep, you don't remember the words as well, in general, but you're also much more inclined to remember the negative words rather than the neutral or positive words. And he says, it's kind of this horrifying possibility that if you're chronically sleep deprived, you have this narrative about your life that's just way overly negative. And so we talk in the book about various ways that we can help kids get more sleep. And in public school, I occasionally will write kids letters try to get them out of first period. Probably the most important thing is for kids not having their cell phone in their rooms. Just having the phone, even if it's not turned on, diminishes the quantity and quality of sleep. Many kids, and Ned deals with so many kids at 16 and 17, and they all say, well, I need my phone as an alarm clock. And Ned, literally, every single week, orders an alarm clock for a kid on Amazon. He says, you go to Murray, it's $40,000 a year, and the parents pay me hundreds of dollars an hour to tutor you. And you're telling me that nobody can find $14 for an alarm clock? And so the sleep part is huge. And the last thing, the last couple of chapters in the book are about, well, actually, before I tell you that, this chapter in the book on kids with LD, ADHD, and autism, I'll talk through a little bit of stuff that's in there. I think that the most important, if I could do one thing to help kids and families, it would be to eliminate homework-related stress. And it seems to me so crazy that people have been studying the effects of homework on learning now for 90 friggin' years. And nobody's found that it contributes to learning in elementary school. Why is there so much stress and suffering related to getting homework done? If I could do anything, it'd be. Well, there's a chapter in a book called "Taking a Sense of Control Goes to School," or "Taking a Sense of Control to School." And what we recommend regarding homework is inspire, don't require. Inspire kids to learn at home. Tell kids, if you can spend time on this, you can spend half an hour on this or an hour on this, it'll change your brain. And then when you go to sleep, you'll make new connections in your brain that make that beautiful. And if something's hard for you, and what I see all the time is I see kids, not at this school, but I see kids who have learning disabilities and who hate to read. They're bad readers, and the instruction is read to your parents for 20 minutes at night. And the kid hates it, the parents hate it, and it's just so completely counterproductive. It's absurd, because that anything you're trying to do, if you're tired, if it's hard for you, don't try to do it at night when you're tired. It's ridiculous. And so I think that fighting excess homework is one of the best things we can do in terms of establishing a sense of control, because being overwhelmed by homework for both parents and kids is bad from a sense of control point of view. And it's just also, the same brain systems, if you're listening to me talk right now, What activates in your brain is in your left temporal cortex, which does language comprehension and verbal memory. If you read a transcript of what I'm saying, what activates, the ink on the page goes to your visual cortex in the back, and then it goes up to these same brain systems. So that if you read to your kid, or a kid listens to recorded books, he's activating and developing the same brain system to do reading comprehension. So we empower kids by saying, you develop a comprehension brain by listening. And as opposed to just make him do this stuff at night. We work on the hard stuff during the day. You work on the hard stuff at school when you're alert, but not at night. So that's one of the points that a lot of emphasis on helping kids better understand themselves, understand their brain, a big emphasis on Plan B thinking, which is very useful. We talk quite a bit about the use of rewards, because one of the great challenges for kids with LD and ADHD is that much of our efforts are to help them to do well. And oftentimes, in my experience, that it's at the expense of helping kids understand who's responsible for what. And that so I see all these underachievers, and I ask them, if you don't turn in an assignment, who's most upset? And invariably, who's most upset? My mom. Who's next most upset? My dad. Who's next most upset? My teacher. Who then? My counselor. Who then? My tutor. And oftentimes my sister's on the list because she's tired of all the fighting, And it just seemed to me, when I started to see this, I said, there's something wrong with this picture. The kid's never on the list. And but it comes back to this idea of we don't want to work harder. But many of the interventions, and many of these kids, I consider to be semi-professionals. I literally had a kid say, tell me about your typical, master underachiever. Tell me about your typical evening. So it's, 6 to 6:30 we have dinner, and then 6:30 to 8 I pretend to do my homework. Great use of energy, right? So I think that I'm all for kind of homeschool communication programs so kids remember to bring stuff home and turn it in. But I want to offer that to kids. I don't want to lay it on them. Because again, if you spend 90 units of energy trying to help a kid solve a problem, the kid will spend 10. And if you get more anxious and go up to 95, he'll go to 5. And in my experience, it just doesn't change until the energy changes. And so we talk about the use of rewards, and my angle on it is that there are kids with ADHD, their brains just don't activate to do boring homework. And I'm okay saying, look, I know when you sit down to do this stuff, there's not enough dopamine in the frontal cortex to focus on it. And if a reward would help jack up your dopamine a little bit, I'm okay with that. But I don't like the idea of unless kids are really out of control, then we use then behavioral stuff is important. But for most kids, that we know that the use of rewards undermines internal motivation. It just does. And they even start to figure out that the brain mechanism of why, if you get rewarded for doing something you like to do, you're less likely to do it. And so, with that in mind, I'm just thinking there's stuff in the book about how can we use rewards for kids who just want to activate in a way that's respectful to them and doesn't feel like we're doing it to them rather than for them. Now, I'll close by saying that the last 2 chapters in the book are about what I consider to be delusional understanding of what success is and how you become successful that many kids grow up with. And certainly in this area in New York, a lot of the really high intensity areas here. And what I mean by that is that, there's so much that's insanity about that the most important outcome of adolescence is getting into the most absolutely elite college you can. And I tested a girl a month ago who gave me a nice perspective on this college business. As interviewing her, I said, is there stuff you worry about? She said, well, I want to do good in school because I know my school counts for college, and I want to go to a good college. And I want to go to AU because they have an elevation burger, and I love their fries. But I gave a lecture to an AP 11th grade English class at Whitman a few years ago on the brain or something, and the kids were very respectful, and they had asked questions, and the teacher came up to me and whispered to me at the end. She said, "These kids all think it's either Yale or McDonald's." And a couple months later, I was at Sidwell meeting with the teachers, and a ninth grade teacher said, "These kids all are terrified by the time they're in ninth grade about that they won't get into an elite enough college." And the kids in this area have this idea that somehow that the road to success is incredibly narrow. And that if you ever get off this very narrow path, you're sunk. And when I first moved here, I grew up in Seattle. And I aspired, as I told you, I aspired, like most of my friends, to go to the University of Washington and got a 2.8, so I could do that. And when I moved out here, within the first month, somebody cried, a mother cried, because her eighth grader didn't have any intellectual interest. And somebody had no intellectual interest until I was almost 19. I mean, it was a little hard. This seemed like a different place than where I grew up. A couple months later, I'm talking with a woman who said, I'll only pay for college if it's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Brown. And I said, well, you realize it's a little crazy, I mean, in the sense that most successful people didn't go there. And she said, and I got a letter from her husband a week later saying that I'd been abusive to his wife by saying that's a little crazy. No, but it is. I mean, I thought about it as I used to refer to it as kind of a mass psychosis. But then a couple of years ago, I looked at the DSM, and there's actually a diagnosis called shared delusional disorder. I thought this is it's like if your parents, you grow up, your parents think that the government's poisoning your water. I mean, you got to grow up sharing this delusion, but I think that just slightly over a third of the population gets a college degree. Did you know that? For years it was 25%, and right now it's just about a third, which means that 2/3 of the population doesn't get a college degree. In part because college is hard, right? And there's so many ways that people make a living, and I'm somebody that when I flunked out of graduate school the first time I went, I got into this program, Ph.D. program in English literature in Berkeley, and I was so anxious and insecure, I didn't turn in a single assignment for 2 straight quarters, 20 weeks. Now, when I work with underachievers now, I tell them that, and I say, top that. 20 weeks, nothing. Go. And I set the bar high. But when it happened to me, and then when I got fired from this job typing, it was very embarrassing, and I had very low self-esteem. But very quickly, I realized the best possible thing that could have happened to me. And I think that there's stories in our book. The last chapter in our book, it's called Alternate Routes. And it's about people who became successful, who weren't good students or who flunked out of school. There's a woman in my band who tell her story where she ran away from home when she was 14. And her parents got a letter to stay with the boyfriend. They married this boyfriend, left him, married a doctor who took advantage of her, and she was still underage. And then was living with this doctor and started taking colleges in some little college up in New Hampshire. And then her next educational experience was the Harvard Divinity School. And she finished a year of the Divinity School. She said, well, I'm a single mom. I'm not going to be able to make a living. So she got an MBA. And then she worked as a business consultant for years, and it wasn't satisfying. In the last 20 years, she's been teaching yoga and meditation to veterans. And she's an incredible human being. And if you knew her when she was 14, and she'd run away from home. She was living with her boyfriend. She got pregnant when she was 16. You wouldn't necessarily think she'd end up at Harvard Divinity School or get an MBA, or do this incredibly fulfilling, rewarding work. There's stories like that, and I wonder, why don't we just tell kids the truth? In fact, I have an article coming out in Time. It's just called, why don't we just tell kids the truth about success? Why don't we tell them that it doesn't make very much difference, according to most of the research, where you go to college in terms of how much money you make, how your career success, how satisfied you are with your life, with your personal life. It just doesn't seem. Why don't we just tell kids that there's advantages to going to elite schools? That there's advantages to always being a good student. But it's not necessary to create a life. And so many of the kids with learning disabilities and ADHD are going to be late bloomers. They figure if the valedictorians, or the good things in life would be taken by the top students, I'm screwed, and why bother? And that's why the lab school does such a beautiful job. The gala honoring these people, giving kids the message, the road to success. There's many roads to success. It's a broad path. And telling the kids about the various ways that people make it. My brother-in-law went to 5 different colleges. I just bounced around and it was barely graduated from college. And he started working as a cook in a restaurant. He loved food and he loved restaurants. And eventually he had his own hot dog stand in Tampa for a while. And then I think he was working for a chain like Houston's or something like that as a kind of a manager, low-level manager. And he started doing some purchasing. And he'd been doing that for a year or so, and P.F. Chang called him when they had 3 stores and said, would you do some part-time purchasing for him? And they liked his work, so they hired him when they had 6 stores. And he got stock in P.F. Chang's. And for the next 20 years, he ordered the big horses out in front, everything in the store for 20 years, and went all over the world. And then when P.F. Chang went public, he made a ton of money and was able to. He's working for another company now. He could retire easily. He's a wonderful person and has a wonderful life. The point is this: I've never met a kid who's 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 who, when you say, "What do you want to do for a living?" they say, "I want to be a purchaser." There's something like 3,500 occupations. Mike Rowe's website says the 3,000 jobs that don't require a college degree that pay well. That in the book, there's a story about these 2. I called this psychologist to talk about one of his clients, who's the father of one of my kids I tested. And I tested the psychologist's kid many years ago. So I said, "Tell me about your kid." He said, "Well, both my boys," and this is a Ph.D. psychologist, wife is an oncology nurse. He said, "Both of my boys didn't want to go to college. One went to Full Sail, an art school in Florida, and now is one of the top videographers in LA. The other one flunked out of the art school of LA, came here and dropped out of the art school of Maryland, but just learned so much graphic art stuff. He's extremely successful graphic designer." He said, "Both boys make more money than I do." And he said, "And I learned that when you see a spark, pour gasoline on it." And I think that we want kids to have an accurate model of reality. And we want them to let them know how many people who struggled in school early on have made incredible contributions to this world. We want to keep the focus not on grades, but on developing themselves as people, as learners, so that they have something to contribute to this world. And I'll close just by saying that some of you, I'll say that we also have a chapter on college. And in this area, I think that there's all this focus on going to college, and people don't tell kids that college is the most dysregulated learning environment outside of a war zone, and that the mental health crisis on college campus is just off the charts. They can't hire mental health people fast enough. So part of the reason that Ned and I feel that so strongly about wanting kids to give them a lot of practice running their own life is we want to send them off to college. We want them to be very adept at making decisions, at being able to manage their sleep, manage their use of technology before they go into this completely unregulated living environment where the average bedtime is 3 to 4 a.m. and where drinking 5 nights a week seems normal. So I'll just close by saying that we close the book by quoting, it's attributed to Maya Angelou, but I think other people have said it, that people will remember most of what we say to them. They'll forget most of what we say to them. They'll forget most of what we do. But what they'll remember is how we make them feel. And that what we think feel so strongly about, what we want kids to feel is loved and respected and trusted and capable. And that's kind of what the book's about. And so I'd be happy to take any questions. This is always, and Ned and I talk about this all the time, this is always the first question. Yeah, it's always the first question. Yeah. There's a chapter in the book on technology, which is certainly it's the greatest challenge of parents of your generation. And so our angle on it is that with little kids, when we introduce technology, we want to introduce it with understanding that if you use it inappropriately, or that when we agree upon limits and you violate the limits, then you don't use it for a day or two, and then you get another chance to try it. So the challenge is, as the kids get older, it gets harder to set limits on it, because in part because they know more about it than you do, and they're more and so that and they can undo it. And so we want to, what we recommend in various places in the book is this kind of this process of collaborative problem solving, where what you say to kids and we want to practice empathy, and so we recommend that parents play video games with kids, so that they try to understand what it is. Right, it's hard, but I mean, if kids played baseball, or a kid played football or soccer, most parents, even if they're not interested, they try to find something, they kind of learn about it. But so oftentimes, parents don't know nothing about the games that kids play. And I think that showing interest in it, because it's much easier to guide kids and to lead them away a little bit if we have empathy. So I think we want to say, I know that these games, they're programmed to be so immersive, and there's a lot of, some people know about these ethical issues now, that people are comparing these computer companies to tobacco companies, but basically knowingly making this stuff addictive. So what we want to do, because we don't want to struggle about stuff constantly, chronically. We want to struggle, and we don't want year after year try to protect kids from themselves, because then they put all their energy and try to resist us, as opposed to running their own life and managing their own life. So what we suggest is this process of expressing empathy. And I know how much you love this stuff, and it makes me happy to see you so engaged in it. And I know that and we talk about the cognitive benefits of playing video games, but then you say, as a mother, I also know that the more time you spend in front of a screen, that the more health problems you have, physical health, mental health, attention, and behavior problems you have. And I can't, as a mother, I can't let you do this. And so you work out a contract with him about what just to find something acceptable. It may not be perfect, but something that he can live with and you can live with, and you renegotiate it. But that's the only way that I can see. But I also look for places we have leverage. And certainly, kids can sleep with their phone. I say to parents, say simply, I can't pay your charges if you sleep with your phone. So if you want to get a part-time job to make the money to pay $100 a month for your phone, okay, but I can't pay for the charges if you sleep with your phone. You have leverage about whether kids drive or not. I mean, and particularly what I say to parents is, I want to be able, I can't send you to college until I can see that you can manage your technology. And I think as they get older, that trying to struggle with them constantly just doesn't make any sense. And I think we want to say that we have leverage, is things like that. Part of the reason that I've just been thinking a lot about this, that in terms of this idea that the passionate pursuit of pastimes is the way to develop self-motivation. The passionate pursuit of pastimes is the way to develop self-motivation. The difference between things like playing a sport, or playing music, or working on as a dancer, is that in video games, I don't play myself, obviously, but you don't have to do drill. You don't have to do boring stuff to develop technique. And I think that the programs are so rewarding that you don't have to drive yourself. The program drives you. And I think it's different. But I do think that certainly video games are played by virtually almost anybody who's under 40 plays. Most adults play video games. And I think that there's advantages to it. I mean, the study about laparoscopic surgeons. People that study at Harvard, where laparoscopic surgeon residents, the ones who played a lot of video games, 37% fewer surgical errors. And so the ones who made more errors were prescribed more video games. And it's not black and white, is what we're saying. And in the chapter, it's nuanced, but I think that with younger kids, We set limits, we take it away when they don't use it. And I think with older kids, we start to negotiate more. And then we start to say that we start to look for the points where we have some leverage so we aren't chronically trying to protect them from themselves. Well, I think that certainly I deal with a lot of schools, and sometimes in meetings with kids who have too much homework. And I say, you say you have evidence-based policies. Where's the evidence for the homework policy? Where's the evidence that third graders doing an hour of homework or an hour and a half of homework a night? Where's the evidence for that? It just doesn't exist. And there's a book I like about, I can't remember what it's called, but I think it's by Nancy Kalish. We mentioned it in our book. And what they say is go to school and say, this isn't working for my child. I want to support my child, but I'm not going to take on responsibility to make him do it, because I know that that the most important thing for me is to maintain my relationship with my child, and I'm not going to fight with him every night about homework. And so, what can we do about this? And certainly, one of the things I put in almost all my reports now is the highest priority is minimizing school-related stress, homework-related stress. And I think that you just basically say, I'm not going to do this. What else can we do? And there's a lot of kids that certainly getting a high school kid to come over and help a kid and just be a homework coach is a pretty low-cost way of a lot of, and kids will tend to work better for other kids than they do for adults. And so I'm not again, my angle on homework is I don't want kids to go home and watch TV or play video games all day. I'd like them to learn. I like to be involved. It's just I don't like this idea of you must do this tonight. I'm going to grade you on it, because it confuses the means for the end. Many kids can learn without doing this stuff. I mean, homeschooled kids, they typically work for 2 hours a day, and the idea, and they do as well as college as kids who spend 6 hours in school. So the idea that kids need to do all this homework to learn is ridiculous. So what we say in the book is that we want kids to make informed decisions. And I mean, there's a kid who's here now, who I tested, and I think he was 10, and he was in another independent school. And the parents wanted him here. He didn't want to come. And I recommended that the parents let it be his call, but they just understandably they got anxious and put him here. But I supported it because the kid was so rigid that he wouldn't engage in that kind of pros and cons with his parents. And so what I say to kids is that what I recommend saying is that I want you to practice making decisions, but they have to be informed decisions. Informing means that you talk about it with me and your dad, or we talk about it with somebody else who knows the territory here, who can help you make a good decision. But if we can't discuss it, and we can't look at both things, then I'm going to make the decision for you. I mean, the other side, there's a lot of kids for whom decision making is very anxiety arousing. That's a different kind of kid. And those kids, we want to say that I want you to practice. And the really anxious kids, what I say is that I'll make the decision for you, but for now, because but I want you to tell me, if you're going to make it yourself, what would you say? What would your decision be? We're going to go through this whole process, and if you're too anxious to make it right now, then I'll make it. I'll model how to do it. But I want you. But I'm not going to do it when you're 16 and 17. I'm not going to send you to college before you made the decisions. And it's not just areas like D.C. and New York and Los Angeles. I mean, the 30 or 40% of kids in a Wyoming survey reported very high levels of unhappiness, and that I think that, and the fact is, we sleep as adults. We sleep at least two hours less a night than people did 100 years ago. Kids sleep less than they did 20 years ago, and technology is just making it harder and harder for people to sleep. So just that and alone, that young kids I think are not sleeping, not resting as much. And again, that we're seeing kids now who are on iPads when they're 2 years old. And technology, it's great, but it makes life go faster and it makes it more stressful. So I think that exposing kids to technology is making young kids more and more anxious. And I mean, there's an article in Time magazine probably 12 years ago about this kindergarten, all this anxiety and anger showing up in kindergarten kids, or just and part of it too, frankly, with young kids, is that we have this absolutely absurd idea that if we just teach kids to do academic stuff at younger and younger ages, they'll be better for it. And it's completely untrue. It's completely false. And it just makes life so much more stressful and pressured for kids and their parents and their teachers. But yeah, kids pick up our anxiety, and we pick up theirs. I mean, the amygdala, the part of the brain that senses threat, that if you see, and same with the kids, if they see pictures of people showing an angry face or a fearful face, the amygdala reacts, even if the presentation of the picture is so short that they don't consciously register it. So yeah, I think that we all want to work on our own stress management and trying to ground our thinking in reality and just try to remember what's important so that kids have enough rest. We build in times during the day that are unplugged downtime. But it's hard because it's a stressful culture. Well, thank you so much for coming, folks. I'd be happy to sign any books.